Tarantino swears he's never stolen anything. He calls it homage, borrowing, paying tribute. But when you watch the westerns he grew up on, the influences aren't subtle. These 9 films gave him his best shots, his coolest characters, and some of his most iconic moments. Number 9. Death Rides a Horse. Giulio Petroni directed Death Rides a Horse in 1966, and if you've seen Kill Bill, you've basically already watched half of this movie. The setup is pure revenge western. A young boy watches bandits murder his family. Years later, he's grown up and he's hunting down every single person responsible. Sound familiar? Lee Van Cleef plays a former outlaw just released from prison, who also has a score to settle with the same gang. The two men form an uneasy alliance, circling each other with suspicion while taking down their shared enemies one by one. The structure is episodic, each confrontation revealing another piece of the puzzle about what really happened the night the boy's family died. Tarantino lifted the entire framework for Kill Bill from this film. The list of people to kill, the methodical hunting of each one, the revelation that one of the targets isn't quite what they seem. He even used the same composer, Ennio Morricone. The flashback structure where we slowly learn what happened through fragmented memories, that's straight from Death Rides a Horse. The film's visual style influenced Tarantino heavily. Petroni used extreme close-ups of eyes during tense standoffs, a technique Sergio Leone popularized, but Petroni perfected. Those shots where the camera pushes in tight on someone's face right before violence erupts. Tarantino does that constantly, and it comes directly from this film. There's a scene where Van Cleef faces down multiple gunmen in a saloon, and the geography of the space becomes crucial to the action. Tarantino recreated that same spatial awareness in the Crazy 88 fight in Kill Bill. Every character positioned deliberately, the camera showing you exactly where everyone is before the violence starts. The film cost around $300,000 to make and was shot entirely in Spain, using the same dusty locations every Italian Western used. It made decent money in Europe, but barely played in America. Most people didn't see it until decades later, when VHS collectors started hunting down obscure spaghetti westerns. Tarantino discovered Death Rides a Horse working at a video store in the ACs. He's talked about watching it repeatedly, studying how Petroni built tension and released it through sudden bursts of violence. The film's score, with its haunting harmonica theme, stuck with him so deeply that he tried to get Morricone to write something similar for Kill Bill. When that didn't work out, he just licensed tracks from Death Rides a Horse directly. The ending of Death Rides a Horse, where the young man has to decide whether revenge is actually worth it, influenced the moral ambiguity in Tarantino's revenge narratives. His characters always complete their revenge, but there's rarely satisfaction in it. That bittersweet taste comes straight from Italian westerns like this one, where violence solves nothing and everyone ends up damaged. Number 8. The Great Silence.
But also industrially. So that's a brief summary of what I'll be looking at in this talk.
Sergio Corbucci made The Great Silence in 1968, and it's one of the bleakest westerns ever filmed. Tarantino calls it a masterpiece, and has said it influenced Django Unchained more than any other single film. The story takes place in a snow-covered Utah town where bounty killers have essentially legalized murder by exploiting a loophole that lets them kill outlaws for profit. Jean-Louis Trintignant plays Silence, a mute gunfighter who hunts bounty hunters. Klaus Kinski plays Loco, the most vicious bounty killer in the territory. The two are on a collision course from the first frame, and Corbucci builds the tension with agonizing slowness across frozen landscapes that feel hostile and unforgiving. What sets this film apart is its complete rejection of Western conventions. The hero can't speak, which immediately removes the typical Western banter and threats. The villain is smarter and faster than the hero. And the ending is so dark that American distributors demanded Corbucci shoot an alternate happy ending just to make it releasable in the States. Tarantino watched The Great Silence and absorbed its willingness to subvert expectations. The snow-covered setting influenced the snowy climax of The Hateful Eight. The mute protagonist showed him that characters could be compelling without constant dialogue. And that ending, the original ending that Corbucci fought to keep in the European version, taught Tarantino that audiences could handle nihilistic conclusions if you earned them. The film's use of silence is brilliant. Long stretches pass without dialogue, just wind howling over snow and the crunch of boots. Corbucci lets scenes breathe, trusting the images and the actors' faces to convey emotion. Tarantino does this constantly, holding on faces, letting tension build through silence rather than constant chatter. Klaus Kinski's performance as Loco directly influenced Christoph Waltz's characters in Django Unchained and Inglourious Bastards. Loco is articulate, philosophical even, but absolutely ruthless. He explains his worldview calmly while committing atrocities. Waltz's Hans Landa and Calvin Candy operate the same way, treating evil as a logical business decision rather than an emotional choice. The film bombed commercially. It was too depressing, too cold, too willing to show the hero losing. Italian audiences rejected it. American distributors barely released it. Corbucci's career never fully recovered from the financial failure. But over time, critics and filmmakers recognized it as one of the most powerful westerns ever made. Tarantino's Django Unchained shares the great silence's interest in the economics of killing. Both films examine how violence becomes a commodity, how laws can be twisted to make murder profitable, and how the people enforcing those laws are often worse than the outlaws they hunt. That thematic DNA runs straight through Django. The cinematography by Silvano Ippoliti influenced how Tarantino shoots snowy landscapes. Those wide shots of tiny figures against vast white emptiness, that sense of isolation and doom, you see it repeated in The Hateful Eight. Corbucci proved that westerns didn't need desert and sagebrush. Cold could be just as cinematic and twice as hostile. Number 7. Django.
Django, have you always been alone?
Sergio Corbucci's Django from 1966 is the film Tarantino named an entire movie after. So yeah, the influence is pretty obvious. Franco Nero drags a coffin through the mud into a town caught between Mexican revolutionaries and racist Confederate soldiers who've become bandits. The coffin contains a machine gun, and Django uses it to mow down dozens of men in one of the most iconic sequences in spaghetti western history. Tarantino borrowed the name, the coffin imagery, and the overall tone of a lone gunfighter wading through violence with dead eyes and no illusions. His Django Unchained shares the original's mud-soaked brutality and its fascination with racial violence in the post-Civil War period, even though the plots are completely different. Franco Nero's performance defined the spaghetti western anti-hero. He's not heroic, not even particularly likable. He's a man with a death wish who happens to be better at killing than anyone else. That archetype influenced every Tarantino protagonist, from Mr. Blonde to The Bride to Django Freeman. They're all damaged people who channel their trauma into violence. The machine gun massacre scene in Django gave Tarantino the template for every over-the-top shootout he's ever filmed. The Crazy 88 fight, the Inglourious Bastards theater massacre, the final shootout in Django Unchained. They all owe a debt to that moment when Django opens the coffin and starts firing. It's excessive, almost cartoonish, but played completely straight. Corbucci shot Django in 6 weeks for about $100,000, using the same Spanish locations every Italian Western used. The mud is real, because it rained constantly during production. That grime and filth became part of the film's identity. This isn't a clean, romanticized West. It's ugly and brutal, and everyone's covered in dirt. The film was banned in multiple countries for its violence. The scene where Django's hands are crushed was considered torture porn before that term existed. Britain banned it until 1993. That controversy only made it more popular with cult film fans who sought out bootleg copies. Tarantino cast Franco Nero in a cameo in Django Unchained, specifically to honor the original. That moment when Nero and Jamie Foxx face each other and spell out the name Django is Tarantino's way of explicitly acknowledging the debt. He's not hiding his influences, he's celebrating them. The racial politics in Django are complicated and messy, which probably appealed to Tarantino. The Mexican revolutionaries aren't noble heroes. The Confederate soldiers are monsters. Django doesn't particularly care about either side's cause. He's just trying to survive and maybe rescue the woman he loves. That moral ambiguity freed Tarantino to explore similar themes without feeling obligated to provide clear answers. Django spawned over 30 unofficial sequels, most of them terrible, trying to capitalize on the name recognition. Franco Nero appeared in several of them, but only the original matters. It's the one that established the visual language and tonal approach that influenced generations of filmmakers, Tarantino most prominently among them. Number 6. The Mercenary. Sergio Corbucci shows up again with The Mercenary, also called A Professional Gun, from 1968. This one's about a Polish mercenary named Sergei Kowalski who gets hired by a Mexican peasant revolutionary during the Mexican Revolution. Tony Musante plays Paco, the revolutionary. Franco Nero plays Kowalski. And Jack Palance shows up as Curly, a flamboyant gay hitman hunting both of them. Tarantino pulled multiple elements from this film for both Kill Bill and Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. The structure where a skilled professional teaches combat skills to a less experienced fighter, and they develop a complex friendship. That's the entire Pai Mei training sequence. The visual style, with characters dressed in colorful, almost theatrical costumes against dusty Mexican landscapes, influenced how Tarantino uses color in his westerns. Jack Palance's Curly is the real revelation here. He's a hitman who dresses in all white, carries flowers, speaks multiple languages, and kills people with theatrical flair. He's gay in a way that 1968 Italian cinema could barely acknowledge, but Palance plays him as dangerous and intelligent, not as a stereotype. That character directly influenced how Tarantino writes villains with unexpected characteristics that make them more interesting than standard bad guys. The film's action sequences blend violence with almost balletic choreography. There's a scene where Kowalski teaches Paco how to properly ambush people, and it plays like a darkly comic training montage. Tarantino does this constantly, turning violence into performance art, while acknowledging the real consequences of what's happening. Ennio Morricone's score for The Mercenary is incredible, mixing traditional Western themes with European classical influences and Mexican folk music. Tarantino used Morricone tracks from this film in Kill Bill Volume 2, specifically during moments when he wanted to evoke the spaghetti Western tradition while telling a completely different story. The film cost around $800,000 and shot in Almeria, Spain, the spaghetti Western capital. Every rock formation and dusty street in these films looks the same because they were all filmed in the same square mile of Spanish desert. That recycled geography became part of the genre's charm, and Tarantino embraced it when shooting Once Upon a Time in Hollywood's Western sequences. Corbucci's political interests shine through The Mercenary more than most spaghetti Westerns. He's genuinely interested in revolutionary politics, in how peasants organize against oppression, and how foreign mercenaries exploit those struggles for profit. Tarantino borrowed that interest in political violence and economic exploitation for Django Unchained, examining how slavery functioned as both moral horror and economic system. The relationship between Kowalski and Paco influenced how Tarantino writes partnerships between his characters. They don't particularly like each other at first. They're using each other for mutual benefit. But gradually, respect develops, even friendship, though neither would admit it. That dynamic plays out between Jules and Vincent, between the bride and Pai Mei, between Django and Schultz. The Mercenary was a modest hit in Europe, but barely played in America. United Artists released it with terrible dubbing and cut 20 minutes for pacing. The full version didn't surface in the States until DVD. Tarantino discovered it through import VHS tapes and fell in love with its mix of action, politics, and dark comedy. Number 5. The Big Gundown. Sergio Solima directed The Big Gundown in 1966, and it might be the most politically sophisticated spaghetti western ever made. Lee Van Cleef plays a lawman hunting Thomas Milian's peasant revolutionary across the Mexican border. But as the pursuit continues, Van Cleef starts realizing he's been manipulated by wealthy landowners using the law to eliminate threats to their power. Tarantino borrowed the entire structure for parts of Django Unchained and The Hateful Eight. The idea of a manhunt that gradually reveals corruption at the highest levels, where the people claiming to represent law and order are actually the worst criminals, that's pure Solima. Tarantino just applied it to slavery and post-Civil War bounty hunting. The film's action sequences are brutal and realistic in ways most spaghetti westerns avoided. When people get shot, they don't die dramatically. They fall down, bleeding and suffering. Solima wanted audiences to feel every bullet, every knife wound, every broken bone. Tarantino absorbed that commitment to showing violence honestly rather than glamorizing it. Thomas Milian's performance influenced how Tarantino writes characters who are smarter than everyone assumes. Cuchillo appears to be an illiterate peasant, but he's actually brilliant at survival and manipulation. He uses people's prejudices against them, letting them underestimate him until it's too late. That's Steven in Django Unchained, playing the subservient slave while actually running the entire plantation. Ennio Morricone's score for The Big Gundown is one of his best, mixing whistling, guitars, and experimental sounds that shouldn't work but create incredible tension. Tarantino licensed tracks from this film for Kill Bill, and has said Morricone's work on Solima's westerns taught him how music could drive narrative and emotion in ways dialogue couldn't. The film cost around $500,000 and was shot in Spain and Italy over 10 weeks. Solima was more interested in political themes than most exploitation directors, and he packed the film with commentary about class warfare, legal corruption, and how justice systems protect the powerful while crushing the poor. The final confrontation between Van Cleef and the real villain, a wealthy railroad baron who's been orchestrating everything, influenced how Tarantino structures his climaxes. The person who seems like the main antagonist often isn't. There's someone else pulling strings, someone respectable and powerful who never dirties their own hands. That's Calvin Candy, that's Bill, that's the structure Tarantino uses repeatedly. The Big Gundown made decent money in Europe, but American distributors butchered it, cutting political content and adding terrible dubbing. The full version with proper subtitles didn't surface in America until the 2000s. By then, Tarantino had already absorbed its lessons from bootleg tapes and festival screenings. Solima's camera work influenced how Tarantino shoots wide landscapes and intimate close-ups. The film alternates between vast desert vistas that make humans look insignificant and extreme close-ups during dialogue that force you to read every micro-expression. Tarantino uses that same contrast constantly, pulling back to show scope, then pushing in to examine characters under pressure. Number 4. Ja Beast Day of Anger. Tonino Valerii directed Day of Anger in 1967, and this is the film that gave Tarantino the entire blueprint for the mentor-student relationship in Django Unchained. Giuliano Gemma plays Scott, a street sweeper who's treated like garbage by everyone in town. Lee Van Cleef plays Frank Talby, a legendary gunfighter who takes Scott under his wing and teaches him how to shoot, how to command respect, and ultimately how to kill. The structure is identical to Django and Schultz's relationship. An older, experienced killer teaches a younger man the skills he needs to survive, but those lessons come with moral complications. Talbot isn't a good man. He's a cold-blooded murderer who sees killing as a craft to be perfected. Scott idolizes him at first, but gradually realizes his mentor is a monster. Tarantino lifted entire scenes from this film. The training sequences where Talby teaches Scott how to draw faster, how to position himself in a gunfight, how to read an opponent's intentions. Those show up almost shot for shot in Django Unchained, when Schultz teaches Django the bounty hunting trade. The power dynamic, the gradual shift from teacher-student to equals to rivals, that's all Day of Anger. Van Cleef's performance here is colder and more calculating than his other spaghetti western roles. Talby speaks in aphorisms about violence and power, treating murder as philosophy. That influenced how Tarantino writes his mentor characters. They're articulate, even charming, but there's something fundamentally broken in how they view human life. The film's climax involves Scott realizing he's become everything he hated about the men who abused him. He's gained power and respect through violence, but lost his humanity in the process. That moral crisis mirrors Django's realization that Schultz's methods, while effective, come with costs Django isn't willing to pay. Riz Ortolani's score is fantastic, less famous than Morricone, but equally effective at building tension. Tarantino used tracks from this film in Kill Bill, specifically during training sequences where characters are learning the deadly skills. The music conveys both the excitement of mastering something difficult and the danger of what that mastery enables. The film cost around $400,000 and was shot in the usual Spanish locations with some Italian interiors. Valeri was one of the better spaghetti western directors, more interested in character development than just stringing together shootouts. That psychological depth made Day of Anger more than just another revenge western. The final confrontation between Scott and Talby influenced every Tarantino film where a student must surpass or destroy their teacher. The student has learned everything the teacher knows, but retains humanity the teacher lost. That same dynamic plays out between the bride and Bill, between Django and Schultz, even between Cliff and Rick in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. Day of Anger made modest money in Europe, but was barely released in America. Embassy Pictures picked it up for US distribution, cut 15 minutes, and dumped it into drive-ins with minimal promotion. The full version didn't surface stateside until decades later, when spaghetti western fans started importing European cuts. Tarantino discovered this one later than some of the other Italian westerns, but once he saw it, he recognized its importance immediately. He's called it one of the most underrated westerns ever made, and has said Lee Van Cleef's performance as Talby ranks among the best in the genre. That's high praise from someone who's seen every spaghetti western ever produced. Number 3. For a Few Dollars More. Sergio Leone's For a Few Dollars More from 1965 is where the spaghetti western truly became an art form. The first Dollars film was a success, but this sequel elevated everything. Clint Eastwood returns as the man with no name, now paired with Lee Van Cleef as a rival bounty hunter. They're both hunting the same outlaw, El Indio, played by Gian Maria Volonté, and they form an uneasy partnership to split the reward. Tarantino borrowed the entire structure of characters with separate agendas working together toward a common goal. Reservoir Dogs, Pulp Fiction, The Hateful Eight, they all use this framework. People with competing interests forced into collaboration, with constant tension about who might betray whom first. Leone perfected that dynamic here, and Tarantino has been mining it ever since. The film's use of flashbacks to slowly reveal character motivations directly influenced how Tarantino structures his narratives. We don't learn Van Cleef's true motivation until deep into the film, when a pocket watch and a musical theme trigger memories of a murdered sister. Tarantino does this constantly, holding back crucial information and then revealing it through carefully placed flashbacks that recontextualize everything we've seen. Ennio Morricone's score is iconic, particularly the pocket watch theme that becomes El Indio's calling card. The way Leone uses that music, having characters hear it diegetically within the film world, influenced how Tarantino thinks about sound design. Music isn't just background, it's part of the story, something characters respond to and use as psychological weapons. The final three-way duel is one of the most perfectly constructed sequences in cinema. Leone takes his time, showing every glance, every bead of sweat, every hand moving toward a gun. He stretches maybe 15 seconds of real time into several minutes of screen time through pure cinematic technique. Tarantino studied this obsessively. Every standoff he's ever filmed, from Reservoir Dogs to The Hateful Eight, uses Leone's grammar of cutting between faces and hands to build unbearable tension. For a few dollars, more cost $600,000, triple the budget of the first film. Leone used that money for bigger set pieces, more extras, and more elaborate cinematography. The film made over $15 million worldwide, proving the first film wasn't a fluke and setting up the even more ambitious, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Lee Van Cleef's performance here launched his entire career. He'd been a character actor in American westerns for years, usually playing villains, but Leone saw something else in him. Van Cleef brings dignity and intelligence to Colonel Mortimer, playing him as the most dangerous man in any room precisely because he's calm and methodical. That archetype shows up constantly in Tarantino's work, the soft-spoken professional who's more lethal than the loud, aggressive characters. The film's violence was shocking for 1965. Bodies pile up, people die slowly and painfully, and Leone lingers on the aftermath rather than cutting away. That commitment to showing violence honestly influenced Tarantino's entire approach to depicting death on screen. It's not clean or quick. It's messy and horrible and has real consequences. Clint Eastwood was becoming a massive star because of these films, and his performance here is even more refined than the first. The poncho, the cigar, the squint, it all became iconic. Tarantino has talked about how Eastwood's minimalism taught him that sometimes saying less is more powerful than long speeches. Let the actor's face and body language do the work. For a few dollars more is also a masterclass in widescreen composition. Leone uses the full frame constantly, placing characters on opposite sides and letting negative space create tension. Tarantino absorbed those lessons and applies them whenever he shoots in wider aspect ratios. The space between characters matters as much as the characters themselves. Number 2. Once Upon a Time. In the West, Sergio Leone spent 4 years after The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, planning his masterpiece and Once Upon a Time in the West. From 1968 is exactly that. This isn't just a Western, it's a meditation on the death of the Old West, on mythology versus reality, on how violence shapes and destroys the people who commit it. Tarantino has called it the greatest achievement in the history of cinema, and its influence permeates everything he's ever made. The opening sequence is 10 minutes of almost pure silence. 3 gunmen wait at a train station. A fly buzzes, water drips, knuckles crack. Finally, Charles Bronson arrives and the violence erupts. Leone takes his time because he knows patience creates tension better than any amount of dialogue. Tarantino learned that lesson and uses it in every film. The opening of Inglourious Bastards, the Crazy 88 fight, the entire structure of The Hateful Eight, they all owe a debt to Leone's willingness to let scenes breathe. Henry Fonda playing a villain was revolutionary. Fonda had spent decades as Hollywood's conscience, playing honest men and heroes. Leone cast him as Frank, a dead-eyed killer who murders children, specifically because he wanted to destroy that image. Tarantino does the same thing with his casting, putting actors known for one type of role into completely different contexts to create cognitive dissonance in the audience. The film's structure influenced how Tarantino builds his narratives. Multiple storylines intersect around a piece of land that represents the future of the West. Each character has their own agenda, their own backstory, their own reasons for being there. Leone reveals those motivations gradually through flashbacks and dialogue, exactly like Tarantino does in Pulp Fiction and The Hateful Eight. Ennio Morricone's score is arguably the greatest film score ever composed. Each main character has a distinct musical theme that plays whenever they appear or are mentioned. That leitmotif approach influenced how Tarantino thinks about music in his films. Characters bring their own sonic identity with them, and the music tells you things the visuals can't. The flashback reveal of why Bronson's character Harmonica is hunting Frank is one of the most powerful sequences in cinema. A young boy forced to support his brother's weight as he hangs with a noose around his neck, with Frank's harmonica shoved in the boy's mouth. It's horrifying and brilliant, and it makes the final confrontation between them resonate on a level pure plot never could. Tarantino uses that same technique of delayed revelation to maximum emotional impact. Once Upon a Time in the West cost $5 million, an enormous budget for a Western in 1968. Leone shot in Monument Valley, the John Ford location, specifically to invoke classic American Western imagery while subverting it. Everything looks like a traditional Western, but the morality and the violence are pure spaghetti. Tarantino does the exact same thing in Django Unchained and Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, using familiar American iconography while telling very different stories. The film bombed in America initially. Paramount cut 20 minutes for pacing and released it with terrible marketing. American critics and audiences didn't know what to make of it. Too slow, too operatic, too weird. But in Europe, it was recognized immediately as a masterpiece. Over time, American critics reassessed it, and now it's considered one of the greatest films ever made. Claudia Cardinale's character, Jill, influenced how Tarantino writes his female characters. She's not passive, she's not there for romance. She's a survivor using every tool at her disposal to secure her future in a world dominated by violent men. That pragmatic strength shows up in Jackie Brown, Kill Bill, and Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. Leone's camera work here is as good as cinema gets. Those extreme close-ups of eyes, those wide shots of landscapes dwarfing human beings, those carefully composed frames where every element matters. Tarantino studied every shot in this film and absorbed Leone's visual language completely. You can see it in how he composes frames, how he uses close-ups, how he lets landscapes tell part of the story. Number 1. The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. Sergio Leone's The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly from 1966 isn't just the most influential Western on Tarantino. It might be the most influential film on Tarantino, period. This is the template for everything he does. The structure, the pacing, the violence, the dark humor, the operatic emotion, the pop culture references masquerading as high art. It's all here. The film follows 3 gunslingers hunting Confederate gold during the Civil War. Clint Eastwood is the good, a bounty hunter with flexible morals. Lee Van Cleef is the bad, a hitman who kills for money and pleasure. Eli Wallach is the ugly, a Mexican bandit who's smarter than anyone gives him credit for. They use each other, betray each other, and ultimately need each other to find the gold. That 3-way dynamic influenced Reservoir Dogs, Pulp Fiction, and The Hateful Eight directly. Tarantino loves triangular relationships where characters form temporary alliances that shift constantly. Nobody fully trusts anyone, but they're stuck together by circumstances. Leone perfected that structure here, and Tarantino has been working variations on it his entire career. The film's length, 2 hours and 41 minutes, proved that Westerns could operate on an epic scale while still maintaining intimate character focus. Tarantino's films keep getting longer because Leone showed him that audiences would sit through extended runtimes if every scene earned its place. The Hateful Eight at 2 hours and 48 minutes is Tarantino directly following Leone's example. Ennio Morricone's score is the most famous Western soundtrack ever composed. That main theme, the extended ecstasy of gold sequence, the use of voices and unconventional instruments, it revolutionized film music. Tarantino finally got to work with Morricone on The Hateful Eight, a collaboration he'd dreamed about since he first saw this film. The Civil War scenes, particularly the bridge battle, influenced how Tarantino depicts historical violence. Leone doesn't romanticize the war. He shows it as chaos and waste, with soldiers dying for objectives that don't matter. That cynical view of military violence runs through Inglourious Basterds and Django Unchained. History isn't noble. It's bloody and stupid, and the people caught in it suffer. The final 3-way duel in the cemetery is the most famous sequence in spaghetti Western history. Leone stretches it to 12 minutes through pure editing mastery. Faces, hands, guns, grave markers, eyes, more faces. The tension becomes almost unbearable before a single shot is fired. Tarantino has been chasing that same effect in every climactic scene he's ever written. The film cost $1.2 million, the biggest budget Leone had ever worked with. He shot in Spain, Italy, and briefly in California for the Civil War scenes. The production lasted nearly a year, with Leone obsessing over every detail. That perfectionism influenced Tarantino's own working methods. His insistence on getting every shot exactly right, no matter how long it takes. Eli Wallach's performance as Tuco is the soul of the film. He's funny, pathetic, vicious, and strangely sympathetic. Leone gave him more depth than most Western characters got, showing his family, his history, his fears. Tarantino learned that even criminals and killers need dimensionality. Samuel L. Jackson in Pulp Fiction, Christoph Waltz in Django Unchained, they're all descendants of Tuco. The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly made over $25 million worldwide and became one of the highest-grossing films of 1967. It turned Eastwood into a massive star and proved spaghetti westerns could compete with American productions. More importantly for Tarantino, it proved that genre films could be art, that westerns could tackle big themes while still delivering action and entertainment. Tarantino has said he's watched this film over 100 times. He studied the editing, the performances, the music, the pacing, everything. When people accuse him of stealing from other movies, this is the one he's most openly stolen from. And he's never apologized for it, because Leone created something so perfect that borrowing from it isn't theft, it's education. Every frame of this film is a masterclass in cinema, and Tarantino attended that class more faithfully than any other student. Tarantino never hid where he got his ideas. He wore his influences on his sleeve and dared you to call him out. Leone, Corbucci, Sollima, they built the foundation. Tarantino just knew how to steal from the best and make it feel new again. That's not plagiarism, that's film school.